Lent goes on for so long. And so I'm honored that you'd stick around. And excited to be there during Holy Week. Such good memories. And I am disappointed about the donkey, however. That's, I think I'll get over that. So, well, I did put together a study guide to go along with last week's lesson. And I didn't get it till Jimmy until yesterday. And he might have, I guess, missed it. And so I just sent it to him again. So hopefully that will be going out, and I'll try to get this week's study guide done before I leave for New York on Saturday. This week, we're going to be talking about the story of Jesus's temptations, which normally occurs at the beginning of Lent, traditionally on the first Sunday in Lent. It's always a focus upon Jesus's temptations. The 40 days of Lent, not counting Sundays, are based upon the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness. And obviously, the 40 is meant to remind us readers of the Gospels of the 40 years the Israelites spent in the wilderness, the 40 days Elijah spent in the wilderness, and so on. And so, for a lot of ways, as Christians, this is sort of the wilderness story that we look to and try to make sense of. And traditionally, how this story has been interpreted has been that it's a story to tell us about who Jesus is and who Jesus is not. But I'm going to try to talk about that, but also try to apply in some general terms what Jesus's temptations mean for us, and that they are temptations for us to be something other than who God created us to be. And what's interesting about this story, to try to reset it in the gospel story, is that the Gospels who tell this story place it immediately after what is a high point of Jesus's life. Jesus has just been baptized by John the Baptizer, and the Gospels differ, but all of them agree that either Jesus or the crowds gathered all heard a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And so it's this huge moment of validation, authentication, of calling, even of identity, where Jesus has this connection with God, hearing a voice from heaven that states, "This is who you are, and therefore who you were created to be." And we all crave a moment like that, where we have a moment of clarity about who we are, who our identity is, who we were meant to be, what we were meant to do with our lives, a connection with God that validates us and declares that we are beloved and loved by God. And Jesus has this moment, and then immediately afterwards has this time of testing and trial and temptation, where he is confronted and asked to be something other than who God created him to be. It's questioning of, are you really the Son of God? Are you really beloved by God? Are you really what you just thought you were? And so we see this same process throughout Scripture. The Apostle Paul, we talked about last week, has this revelatory vision of God, of either in his mind or maybe transported physically into heaven. And then he's given this thorn in the flesh, this stake to impale him, whatever that means, the big trial that he asks to be removed, but it isn't removed. Elijah the prophet has this big showdown with the enemies of God, where the power of God works through him in miraculous ways. And then immediately afterwards, he wants to give up and die. The Israelites experienced the miracles of being released from Israel, the parting of the Red Sea. They escape, and they immediately say, when they experience trial in the wilderness, we wish we were slaves again. At least we wouldn't die of starvation. And so it seems that paired with the high points in our lives, we experience the low points in our lives. It's what I'm going to be preaching on Sunday. Jesus experiences the triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, but within a matter of days, the people cheering him and praising him are crying out for him to be crucified and mocking him. And so it's a reminder that we don't ever get to stay on the high points, the peaks in our lives. We also have the valleys. And how do we negotiate living with both? Because life doesn't give us one or the other. And one of the major themes of Jesus's temptation is, will he do things on his own, or will he depend upon God? And so what I'd like you to think about as we talk about the idea of dependence upon God or dependence upon others, were there times in your lives when you had to depend upon other people to help you do what you could not do on your own? And how does that feel? And hopefully you might want to share. What I will share is, for those of you who are around when I left New York, I literally was off the clock working in at the church in Manhasset, and the moving vans were coming the next day, and I got hit in the face, and a retina detached in my right eye. Oh. And so I had to have surgery out in Syosset, and I had to lay for 2 weeks on my stomach. Linda and Scott Collins shared with me this thing, because Scott Collins, if you remember him, had the same thing happen to him. And I had to lay on this table thing where I stuck my head through a board so that the silicone they stuck in my eye would float to the top, the back of my eyeball and push my retina.
Tell them how you were hit. I don't want people to think that, somebody punched you.
Oh, yeah. This is a part of the parsonage on 90 Country Club Drive that Lori lives in. For Christmas, my older son he'd gotten a Viewmaster projector. If you remember the old Viewmasters with the little wheel, you'd click the thing and the picture and you'd look inside and see it. Well, this would project those wheels, the pictures on a wall, had a light bulb in it. And the darkest place was the steps down to the basement in that house. And there was wood paneling all in that basement and on the steps. And somewhere along the life and the history of that house, it had an oil burning furnace, and they had cut a little piece of paneling out that you could pull out and push the button to turn on the oil burning furnace. And I leaned against the wall, and that little square of like heavy knotty pine paneling popped out, and it fell just right to hit me on my cheekbone, right below my eye. And that was what did it. And later that day, my retina in my one good eye, my one not so good eye, but the better eye, began detaching. And we had to drive across country. In it, I had a total of 4, 5 other surgeries in that eye once I got back out to Missouri. I spent a year with silicone in my eye, and it was all inky. And like I said, that's the good eye I really depend upon to see, and my other eye is sort of worthless. And so I was, I don't have great eyesight in the best of times, but I literally couldn't drive, couldn't read, couldn't see things for a year. And I depended on other people and church members to drive me around, and my wife, and I couldn't go to the drugstore. I couldn't drive anywhere to go do anything. I was completely, had no independence at all. And so the smallest of errands required a great deal of planning to figure out how we're going to get there. And meanwhile, poor Jen had a 4-year-old and a 4-month-old that she was dealing with. And I remember feeling very quickly going, this is why older people don't want to give up the car keys and keep driving, even though it's dangerous for them to drive. Because in our culture, unless you are living in the city, with public transportation, you are dependent upon a car. And especially out here in Missouri, there is no public transportation that's worth anything. You are completely dependent upon a car. And I remember thinking, this sucks, pardon my French, because I was completely dependent upon other people to do my job, to get around, to go visit people in the hospital, to get to meetings. And there was so much where I just said, I want to do it myself. And I couldn't. And this is one of the issues, of course, those of you who are older than me know, with aging. It's part of the humbling of it. Which of us wants to be dependent upon our children or grandchildren? I can already feel it when I have to ask my teenage sons to fix something on my phone. I already feel dependent on them and hate it. And our culture values independence and shames us when we are dependent. We want to believe we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We wish to value ourselves based on what we do for ourselves. But in many ways, it's a fiction. We don't exist in isolation. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is a oxymoron. Literally, the bootstraps you pull on boots with, you can't pull yourself up by them. There's no way. We depend upon community. We depend upon good government, hopefully. We depend upon the social contract of other people around us. We are more dependent than we want to admit, but we are culturally conditioned not to like it. And so I'm wondering, and I would just say spiritually speaking, this is a significant barrier for all of us spiritually, because a part of the spiritual journey is learning your limits and depending upon God and not trying to control what we can't control. But yet we are taught from birth to not depend on anyone. And that's a problem if we're going to follow the example of Scripture, especially when we experience moments of wilderness, of loss, of grief, of pain. It's a barrier to our healing. Does that strike a chord with anyone?
Yes,
Along your own
absolutely.
journey?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you care to share, Maria?
I'm still in it. I can't share it yet. Maybe next week.
Okay. All right. Anyone else have any experiences along the way? Margie, did you say something?
No, I think Margot was sort of
Oh,
waving.
okay.
Yeah,
as
here
a-
I am. Yeah, I don't know where it's come from, but Marty and I, who I would consider very independent people, are suddenly realizing that it's, what would that be? False feelings about or thinking about ourselves. So we're going out to California to see the kids for a few days in May. And I just texted our grandson this morning. I mean, I gave him the flight numbers and please pick us up because we don't like to drive anymore and certainly not driving in California. I mean, we've done that a lot, but not with those people on the road. So I'm so glad to hear that because I think we're accepting with grace our limitations and reaching out for help. And boy, I'll tell you, for two very independent people, we're okay with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. And Margot, I thought of you when I was preparing this. You described, after your experiences of tremendous grief, the community of the church helping you and supporting you in your grief. And that to me is inspirational in terms of that's what a community of faith is supposed to do, is support us when we have trouble standing up by ourselves. Anybody else care to share? All right. If you think of any examples, speak up and Jimmy will help me see you. And just know your experiences, I think, matter as much and probably more than whatever I'm going to say. So I'm grateful to hear them. In the story of Jesus's temptation in the wilderness, we can get stuck on the figure of Satan. And if you're my age, I imbibed the picture of Satan from Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck cartoons, always with horns and a tail and a pitchfork. Or maybe we think about Milton or Dante or paintings we've seen from the Middle Ages. And I would just say, I don't know that it's essential that we get stuck on what we believe about the figure of Satan, other than we think about the idea that the temptations that Satan in the story offers are real. Those are real. And, so I'm going to read you a few quotes about dependence that I think will frame understanding Jesus's time in the wilderness. This first one is by Maya Angelou, the poet. She said, "People whose history and future were threatened each day by extinction considered that it was only by divine intervention they were able to live at all. I find it interesting that the meanest life, the poorest existence, is attributed to God's will. But as human beings become more affluent, as their living standard and style begin to ascend the material scale, God descends the scale of responsibility at commensurate speed. In other words, the more we achieve financial independence, wealth, the more we accumulate privilege and power, the less likely we are to look to God for help, to give God any credit for what occurs in our lives, to think in terms of how we got to where we are as grace rather than as something we earned, and the less thankful we are for the blessings in our lives. All because our egos want to put us at the center of every story and want us to believe that we did it all by ourselves, we deserve it all by ourselves, and it's a story about us. And then here's another one by a writer named Elizabeth Agnew Cochran. She said, ultimately accepting the condition of dependence, pardon me, is a means of empowerment. For in recognizing our limits, we open ourselves to God's activity in our lives. And so, this is the case with any kinds of healing, with any kinds of recovery from addiction. Any way of dealing with a problem in our lives involves confronting with honesty our limitations. And when we deny our limitations, that actually prevents us from dealing with the problems in our lives. Anyone who's ever had someone in their life who has been an addict and struggled with addiction understands the denial, the power of denial, of refusing to accept limitations. And like a person who insists they're okay to drive when they've had too much at the bar, we can cause a lot of harm to ourselves and others in our lives when we don't recognize our limits and get help. And then Joan Chittister, who's a Benedictine nun and writes on spirituality, and I love her work. She says, dependence on God may be what is lacking in a society where consumerism and accumulation have become the root diseases of a world in which everything is not enough and nothing satisfies. The myth of our culture is that we can accumulate more and more things and consume more and more, and that will ever be enough. But the truth is, once we get beyond the level of providing for our basic needs, then all our stuff can actually go the other way and detract from a healthy life. Literally, social scientists have done studies on can money buy happiness? And they say, yes, it can, but only to a point. That if you're living in poverty, you don't have enough to eat, you don't know where you're going to live, you don't have clothes to wear, you don't have good schools, good job, good access to assistance and medical care, then yes, more money can give you access to all those things for your needs. But once you hit, this is several years ago now, it's not adjusted for inflation, but once you hit, middle income, 75, 85, 90,000, depending on where you live, by Long Island money, we're probably talking a lot higher. But then there comes a point where accumulating more doesn't bring you happiness. And there comes a point where it starts going the other way, where more money, more problems. And the stuff begins to take away from your joy. And so remembering that we depend upon God instead of accumulating more stuff helps us to lead a happier, more joyful life. And so when Jesus is tempted, if you can remember the three temptations, Matthew and Luke, Matthew, Mark give them in one order, Luke gives them in a different order, but I'm going to stick with Matthew and Mark's order. The first temptation was for Jesus to turn stone to bread, because Jesus was fasting and hungry in the wilderness. The second temptation was for Jesus on top of the temple to throw himself off, and the devil quotes scripture and says, God will send his angels to catch you. And then the third temptation was Jesus takes him up on a high mountain and shows him all the nations of the world and says, if you'll just bow down and worship me, you can have everything. And a writer who's a renowned preacher and scholar, Thomas Long, writes that long before these temptations were Jesus's temptations, they were Israel's temptations. The temptation for food in the wilderness and not depending upon God was what we talked about with Israel and the manna from heaven and depending upon God for daily bread. The temptation of testing God is what the Israelites did in the wilderness repeatedly, saying, God, you do what we say when we say it. And then the temptation of idols, of worshiping something other than God, was what the Israelites were tested and failed with the golden calf, and repeatedly failed later with worshiping other gods. And so, we're seeing a replay of the same story over and over again. And what Thomas Long says is that in and of themselves, the temptations were not bad. They were only good, not great. And often what we're tempted with is to settle for something good that's never as great as what God desires for us and offers us. That's what makes them temptation. If we were, deliberately presented with something bad, we could say no to it. But it's settling for less is often the temptation. Jesus was hungry. He needed food. He clearly could miraculously produce food, and he does in fact produce food and feeds 5,000 people. In Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel, he does it twice, and in John he does it twice. So clearly it wasn't miraculously producing food that was wrong. It was not depending upon God. And the narrative says when Satan leaves, angels show up and immediately feed Jesus, the same way they did for Elijah. And then the miracle of, Jesus jumping off and, is basically the miracle of Jesus using his power to attract followers and his miracles. But what we've seen repeatedly is that miracles never produce faith, that people experience miracles in scripture and in our lives, and as soon as something bad happens, we forget all about the miracles. And what happens is even Jesus's disciples who witnessed his greatest miracles abandon Jesus when things get hard enough. And Jesus making a spectacle of himself would again make him the center of the story rather than God the center of the story. And then the final temptation to power is always the temptation that says we know best better than God. How many times do we say, man, if I ran the world, there would be no traffic on the LIE, or if I ran the world, I don't know what, but there, what we dislike would be fixed. But again, the temptation is to put ourselves in control rather than allowing God to be in control. And for us to make it about us rather than God, to lack that humility. And when we do, we always get less than we could the other way. And so I remember, maybe most of you remember, when GPS first came out. Maybe you bought one of, before we had smartphones, you could buy those GPS units that you could, stick with a suction cup to your windshield while you drove. Here in Kansas City, we have the headquarters of Garmin, one of the places that produced those. And then when the smartphones came out, they really suffered because, Apple and Google began doing it. But it still happens sometimes now. But maybe you had the experience of where it would send you the shortest route, but you knew the roads better and knew that the shortest route often wasn't the fastest route. The most direct route might send you through a neighborhood or send you down a road with a bad speed limit or with a school zone on it. And you knew better to go get on the Garden State Parkway, and you could get there faster. I think about that a lot. And the temptations for Jesus were often a shorter way, maybe more a direct route, but they were not the best route. And so much of what the wilderness is about, we want to avoid these difficult times in our lives, the longer way. But those longer ways may be the ways that are better, that help us to find truth about our lives, that help us to grow spiritually, that help us to put our trust in God, really. The hardest part for me of being a parent, and I've experienced it now with teenagers, is letting your kids fail, letting your kids make mistakes. You just pray the mistakes they make are not the worst kind. But as a parent, that if you don't let your kids fall and scrape their knee, you don't let your kids make a mistake, you don't let your kids make foolish mistakes or unwise mistakes, how will they learn? We as humans have to learn. And we can't make those choices for our kids if they're going to grow up and be independent, and function. And we can't shelter our children from the things. I don't know what went wrong with my generation, but my generation, we were all latchkey kids and, the age of divorce in the 70s and early 80s. And we grew up and became the worst helicopter parents of trying to control every aspect of our kids' lives, and Jennifer and I let our kids when they were little ride their bikes in our neighborhood and play. And we would get calls from other parents. Did you know Julian was over by the school by himself playing on the playground? Well, yes, we did. We encouraged him to go do that. Oh my goodness, well, I just wanted to make sure that you knew he was by himself. And it's like, well, he's got to learn to be by himself sometime, you know. But we want to control everything, and we had to let our kids learn to make mistakes and experience pain. And so the quickest and most direct route may actually not be the best way for us. And sometimes we need to get lost in order to discover new things about ourselves. Let me stop there. Has anybody ever, has anything I've said struck a chord with anybody so far?
Yes, I felt you just talked to myself. You just talked to me. Whatever bothered me, you addressed today was perfect for me.
Oh, good, good. And anybody else?
I have a GPS story about how the machine, the computer, whatever, is only as good as the information that you put in it. So we had friends one time who were flying into JFK. I was going to go pick them up. So I had my phone out, I had the map quest going, everything. And it said it was going to take me like 2.5 hours to get there from Manhasset, which, is insane. But as I was looking at it, it kept taking me off the interstate. So off the parkways. So my assumption was that there was like a wreck or something really bad going on the parkways, because it kept taking me on different roads as opposed to the Belt Parkway and the Cross Island. And it's taking me forever. And so our friends are waiting. So they call Colleen and she said, well, he left here 2 hours ago. I don't know where he is. So she calls me and I'm like, yeah, I apparently there's some like major backup on the LIE in the northern state. I'm driving, but it will not let me get on the interstate. It wants me to stay with these back roads. And so I don't know what it is. And so Colleen pulls it up on her phone and she says, there's not anything going on. There are no traffic jams on the Cross Island or the Belt Parkway. And I'm like, but it keeps telling me not to get on it. She said, I think maybe it has a setting that if you click avoid highways, it will take you other ways than the highways. I had inadvertently clicked that. So the very thing that would have gotten me, quickly and efficiently to JFK, unfortunately, because of my error, led me to wander not in the wilderness for 40 days or 40 hours, but a good 2.5 hours.
Pretty close.
Pretty close.
And and you got lost and you learned a lesson about settings on your GPS. You grew, right? And what Jesus's temptations were about were, the Satan, the devil figure keeps saying, if you are the Son of God, do this. If you are the Son of God, do this. If you are the Son of God, do this. And Jesus has just had confirmation of who he is, his identity, his purpose, and it's immediately called into question. And it reveals the struggle we have internally to remain fixed on who are we and whose are we. We are God's, and we are God's beloved. And all of us spend our whole lives trying to live into that truth. And it keeps getting questioned. And there's an author, a theologian, African-American, called Howard Thurman. And he's deceased, but I love it in terms of what he says. is that ultimately Jesus's temptations were about identity, and that we cause great harm to ourselves and to others when we live contrary to our identity, our true identity. He calls it living at cross purposes. And so he looks at Jesus's temptations and says, each of the temptations is to be something other than his true identity as beloved child of God. And the temptation is to keep trying to prove yourself worthy, prove your self-worth, prove your security. And this is an ego trap. I've certainly lived that way, where I've wanted the right job or the right credential or the right, residence in the right neighborhood, the right club to belong to, because I was looking for some kind of validation of my worth that was outside of me, instead of living out of my center, which is that I don't have anything to prove. When I was born, God declared me, and God declared you, that you're a beloved child of God. And that's your identity. That says you have worth. That says you are something that matters. And whenever we try to prove that worth through something else, then we're in for a disappointment, and we might cause a lot of harm. I mean, think how many parents try to, live out their own dreams through their children, and they view their own success as what their children achieve. The stereotype is of the dad who was a jock, who never made it big, being so hard on his kids in Little League. But it can happen other ways, of pressuring our kids to get into the right universities, to get the right jobs, to so we can show it off to other people. But what happens when our kids, who are their own people, and who make their own decisions, who have their own struggles, don't become who we want them to be? And the truth is, none of us do. And so many of us have major therapy bills where we've spent lots and lots of money because we deal with shame, because our parents always wanted us to be something that we didn't want to be and could never be. Me, in terms of, our experience in Manhasset, I've experienced it everywhere I've been, but man, when you've got a whole community on the North Shore of Long Island filled with overachieving, successful people, talk about the pressure put on kids, and there's such a race to achieve, and that gets put on kids. And the stuff that happens behind closed doors that most people never know about, that ministers on the North Shore of Long Island know about, man, the pain, the addiction, the struggles, the bad choices, the mental health issues, man, despite all the beauty of living on the North Shore of Long Island, there is deep, deep suffering behind the scenes. And that comes from the pressure we all feel to prove our worth, and the pain we feel when we don't live up to false standards of who we are. And so what we gain from Jesus's temptations is Jesus's example to always stay true to who he truly is, that he doesn't have anything to prove. And we're going to talk about this next week when I'm in person, that as Jesus goes through this horrible time in his life, he refuses to prove anything to his accusers, to Pilate, to the chief priests, to the crowds, to the people that question him. His identity is so secure in who he is, he doesn't even try, because he knows that's a losing game. He doesn't have anything to prove, and neither do we. And, that's at the heart of this story. I know our time is winding up, but I'm pretty sure this is not in the Pilgrim hymnal or the New Century United Church of Christ hymnal. I don't know, maybe when, the gospel quartet that, John Walter headed up sang it, maybe they would have sang it, I don't know. But Jimmy and I grew up as Baptists singing a hymn called "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." And the melody of it is kind of schmarmy. And I went through a long time in my life looking down on it and thinking, this is a really, terrible hymn to sing. It sounded so familiar, like Jesus, I took it like Jesus is not my teddy bear or my security blanket. But as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate it, to think of Jesus as a friend or a companion on our journey, a knowing friend who understands our pain, can be a great comfort. And I've had occasions where I've experienced real loss and pain, where visualizing Jesus as a friend, not as some Lord or not as some sage or wise teacher or enlightened being, but as a friend, was a comfort to me. I'm going to read the words to you. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Now that may sound trite, but it is true. Have we trials and temptations? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Can we find a friend so faithful who will all our sorrows share? And Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer. And again, I can't help but think of the tune, which I don't love, but there's a truth in that hymn of visualizing Jesus as our friend and companion who helps us carry our load or bear our burdens, who understands what it is to experience rejection, grief, pain, loss. I just leave that image with you, and in hopes it might be meaningful to you, because it is one that was never meaningful for me, that's become meaningful for me as I've grown older and experienced stuff. And then somewhere, if I can find it, I lost my final temptation. My final quotation. And I'll pull it up real quickly, is, here it is. A minister named Audrey West wrote, "The Jesus that we see in the wilderness in the Gospel of Matthew is the same Jesus after the resurrection who says, I will be with you always, and even unto the end of the age. And so the Jesus who promises that is the same Jesus who went through his own wilderness. And so even in the most forsaken places of wilderness, Jesus meets us in our most difficult tests of our lives. No place is so desolate, so distant, so challenging that Jesus has not already been there. And no test, no temptation is so great that Jesus has not already overcome it. And so the one who's overcome it walks with us as a friend. The same way it means that when we have experienced a grief or a loss, that friend that comes beside us who has likewise experienced grief and loss, and we can look to their example and say, if she got through it, I can get through it too. The same friend who's lost a job, when we lose our job, shows up and comes beside us and walks by us and said, and we know they survived, so can we. The kind of friend who walks beside us, and as we age and experience things, and laughs knowingly with us and says, and we know they made it through it and are still standing. I can too. Well, Jesus is our friend like that. So that's it. That's what I have for you today. So thank you. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything or share anything or ask anything at this point. If not, then I'll say thank you. I'll see you in a few days, some of you, and hopefully see you in person, those of you that are in town and able to come next week.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
See you this weekend.
Okay.